Mrs. Coleman, they're ready for you.
There must be a mistake. I'm only here to sign my employment papers.
No, Mr. Whitfield left very clear instructions.
Why would a man like him remember someone like me?
Because sometimes, the people who stand beside us in silence leave the deepest mark.
The rain had been falling on Cincinnati since before dawn, the kind of steady gray downpour that makes a city feel like it's holding its breath. And inside a marble conference room on the 40th floor of a building bearing his name, Walter Ashford Whitfield was already 3 weeks in the ground. Nobody in that room yet understood that the will about to be read would tear their family apart more completely than his death ever could. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The room smelled of old paper and expensive cologne, and the only sound besides the rain against the windows was the soft click of Nathaniel Reyes's briefcase as he set it on the long walnut table. Preston Whitfield sat with his back straight and his jaw tight, a man who had spent 50 years believing that everything his father built would one day belong to him simply because he had been born first. Beside him, his sister Vanessa Whitfield Cole kept smoothing the same fold in her black dress over and over, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood that no amount of money had ever cured. Her husband, Grant Cole, checked the gold watch on his wrist like a man already counting the hours until the money cleared, already spending in his mind what he had never earned in his life. Nathaniel opened the folder slowly, the way a man opens something he already knows is going to detonate the room. He had been Walter's attorney for 31 years, his only real friend in the last decade of his life. And he was the only person present who understood exactly what was coming and exactly what it was going to cost the people sitting in front of him. He cleared his throat once, adjusted his glasses, and began to read in the flat, careful voice of a man delivering a verdict rather than an inheritance. He read through the preliminary language quickly, the legal boilerplate that no one in the room was actually listening to, until he reached the paragraph that would change everything, and even his own voice caught for half a second before he pushed through it. To my housekeeper, Odessa Rae Coleman, I leave the entirety of my estate. The silence that followed was not the ordinary silence of surprise. It was the silence of a room where every assumption a family had built their whole lives around had just been quietly set on fire. Preston's glass stopped halfway to his mouth, the ice inside it catching the gray light from the window, and for 3 full seconds he did not breathe. Vanessa's hand froze mid-fold on her dress. Grant's watch-checking hand simply dropped to the table, forgotten. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The rain kept falling against the windows as if it hadn't heard the words at all, as if the world outside that room had no idea that everything inside it had just changed. Out in the hallway, past the frosted glass doors, past the receptionist who had stopped typing the moment she heard raised voices begin to build behind the wall, a woman in a plain gray cardigan sat with her hands folded in her lap, waiting on a bench meant for visitors who had nothing to do with the meeting happening a few feet away from her. She wasn't even supposed to be in the building. She had been asked to come in to sign some final paperwork releasing her from employment now that the household she had served for 12 years no longer had an employer to serve. She had no idea that her name had just been spoken inside that room. She had no idea that the folder Nathaniel was holding had her whole life pressed inside its pages. She simply sat, the way she had learned to sit through hard things for most of her 54 years, quiet, still, waiting for whatever came next without expecting very much good. Her name was Odessa Rae Coleman, and for 12 years she had scrubbed the floors, cooked the meals, and kept the secrets of a man whose own children were, at this very moment, learning that he trusted her more than he trusted them. What could a woman who mopped his floors possibly have known that his own son and daughter never did? That question is the one this story is going to answer, slowly, carefully, in a way that will make you look back at every polite smile and every quiet glance between these people and realize you were watching the truth the entire time without knowing it. To understand how a housekeeper came to inherit a fortune that could have bought half the state of Ohio, you have to go back 12 years, long before Walter Whitfield's hands began to shake, long before the guardianship papers, long before the hospital room where a delirious old man would whisper a name that made his own son go pale and leave without a word. You have to go back to a small apartment on the east side of Cincinnati, where a woman named Odessa Coleman was learning how to live in a world that had just taken the only thing she had left to lose. The apartment was modest, the kind of place where the radiator clanked twice before it warmed, and the neighbors upstairs argued gently through the thin ceiling most evenings around 6. On the refrigerator, held up by a small plastic magnet shaped like a football, was a photograph that Odessa passed 100 times a day and looked at maybe half of those times, because looking at it fully still cost her something she wasn't always able to pay. In the photograph, a 19-year-old boy in a community college sweatshirt grinned with the kind of easy confidence that belonged to someone who believed, correctly at the time, that his whole life was still ahead of him. His name was Marcus, and he had been dead for exactly 1 year and 4 months by the time this part of the story begins, killed by a car that never stopped, on a street 2 blocks from the community college where he was 3 semesters away from an engineering degree he had been the first person in his family to attempt. Odessa still set out 2 coffee cups some mornings, without thinking about it, and caught herself only after the second cup was already sitting on the counter, steam rising into air that no one else was there to breathe. She would look at it for a moment, and then quietly pour the second cup down the sink, and go on with her day the way a person learns to go on, which is to say imperfectly, and one small task at a time. She had buried a husband 9 years earlier to a heart that gave out too young, and she had told herself back then that grief was something you survived once, and then carried quietly for the rest of your life. She had not known, until Marcus, that grief could return and take something larger than the first time, and that surviving it twice required a different kind of strength than she had needed the first. Money had become a language she understood only in its absence. The funeral had cost more than she made in 4 months. The case against the driver who killed her son had gone nowhere, the police calling it an unsolved hit and run within 6 weeks, and moving on to newer files, leaving Odessa with a folder of paperwork, a closed case number, and no answers that would ever bring her son back or explain to her why a good boy walking home from an evening class on a well-lit street had ended up dying alone on the pavement while whoever hit him drove off into the dark and simply kept driving. She had asked God about that more nights than she could count, and God, as far as she could tell, had not yet seen fit to answer. It was a cousin who mentioned the job first, at a family gathering where everyone still spoke carefully around Odessa, the way people speak around a wound they're afraid of reopening. A housekeeping position, live out, good pay, working for a wealthy older man out past the edge of the city whose previous housekeeper had retired after 11 years of service. Odessa did not take the job because she wanted it. She took it because her landlord had raised her rent for the second time that year, and because a woman with bills and a broken heart does not always get to choose the shape her healing takes, only whether she shows up for it or does not. The Whitfield estate, when she first saw it, struck her as the kind of house built by a man who had once wanted a family to fill it and had somehow ended up alone in it instead. Marble floors that echoed every footstep. A dining table long enough to seat 12, in a house where, as far as Odessa could tell in those first weeks, dinner was served for exactly 1. She would come to learn the particular loneliness of a very rich man eating alone at the head of a table built for a crowd that had stopped coming around, and she would come to understand, slowly and without either of them ever quite saying it out loud, that the two of them had more in common than either would have guessed on the day she was hired. Walter Whitfield, 78 years old the year she started working for him, was gruff in the particular way of men who had spent their whole lives being obeyed and had never learned another register to speak in. He did not make small talk. He did not thank the household staff, not because he was cruel, but because it had genuinely never occurred to him that thanks were owed. In her first week, he snapped at her over something so small she couldn't remember, months later, what it had even been, some crumb of dust on a windowsill or a dish left half a shade from where he expected it. She did not flinch. She did not apologize more than the situation required. She finished the task she had been doing, set it right, and left the room, the same way she had learned, over the course of a hard life, to leave every room that tried to make her smaller than she was. He noticed that men like Walter Whitfield were used to two reactions from the people who worked for them, either flattery or fear, and Odessa Coleman offered him neither. She offered him competence, quiet dignity, and a complete unwillingness to perform gratitude she did not feel toward a man who had not yet earned it. It unsettled him in a way he could not have explained even to himself, and it planted, without either of them noticing at the time, the first small seed of something that would take years to grow into what it eventually became. The caterer the estate used sent the same rotation of meals every week, technically excellent, entirely without soul, the kind of food built to satisfy a nutritionist rather than a person. Odessa began, without being asked, to leave something different behind some evenings, a pot of greens seasoned the way her grandmother had taught her, cornbread still warm enough to melt butter on contact. A stew that took 4 hours and tasted like it had been made by someone who actually wanted the person eating it to feel cared for. She never said anything about it. She simply left it, the way she left everything else in that house, quietly and without asking for credit. Walter started coming down earlier. He never mentioned the food directly, not at first, but the timing told its own story. And after a few weeks he began eating in the kitchen some evenings instead of at the head of that long, empty dining table, sitting on a stool that had clearly never been used for that purpose before Odessa Coleman started working there. Neither of them said much during those early meals. But something was building in the space between the silence, the way trust often builds, not through conversation, but through the accumulation of small, unremarkable moments that only later reveal themselves to have mattered more than anything either person said out loud. There were two things in that house Odessa was told, plainly, and without much explanation, never to touch. The first was a drawer in Walter's private study, locked, the key kept somewhere she was never shown. The second was an old car sitting under a heavy canvas tarp in the far corner of the garage, which Walter told her, in the same flat tone he used for instructions about the silverware, was being kept for insurance reasons, and was not to be uncovered under any circumstances. She thought nothing of either instruction at the time. Instructions like that were common in houses like this one, the private eccentricities of wealthy men who had learned to guard their things the same way they guarded everything else. She would not learn for years what was actually inside that drawer, or what that car had actually been used for on a night 12 years ago that would eventually connect her own greatest loss to the family she was quietly, unknowingly, coming to belong to. Months passed the way they do in a life rebuilding itself one ordinary day at a time, and slowly, without either of them ever naming it directly, Walter Whitfield began to ask Odessa Coleman questions about her life the way a man asks questions of someone he has started, almost against his own habits, to actually care about. "You're up early again," she said one such morning, setting a pan on the stove without waiting to be asked what he wanted, finding him already awake at the kitchen counter in a robe that cost more than her monthly rent. "Man my age doesn't sleep the way he used to," Walter answered, watching her hands move with the kind of practiced ease that came from doing something for someone you'd decided mattered. "Bones start talking to you at night. Say things you don't want to hear." "Bones lie sometimes," she said. "Mine tell me I'm 80. I check my license every year just to be sure they're wrong." It was the closest thing to a real laugh she'd heard out of him in the 18 months she'd worked there, a short, surprised sound that seemed to catch him as much as it caught her. He began asking about her life in earnest that year, not the polite surface questions employers asked to seem considerate, but real questions, the kind that require you to actually sit with the answer. She told him about growing up in Over the Rhine before it had been rebuilt into something her own mother wouldn't recognize. She told him about her husband, a good man named Curtis who'd worked the docks for 20 years and died of a heart that simply stopped one Tuesday afternoon while he was watching a baseball game. No warning, no goodbye, just a silence where a heartbeat used to be. She told him, carefully, in a voice that had learned to protect itself, that she'd lost a son too, and that some things a mother doesn't get all the way through talking about. Not ever, not even years later. Walter's response to that particular admission was not what she expected. He didn't offer the usual condolences people give when they don't know what else to say. He went quiet in a way that felt less like respect for her grief, and more like he was carrying a weight of his own that her words had accidentally brushed against. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved to the window, to nothing at all, for longer than the moment called for. She noticed it. She filed it away the way she filed away most things in that house that didn't quite make sense, telling herself that a man his age likely had losses of his own buried somewhere, and that grief recognizes grief even when it can't explain why. Across town that same season, Preston Whitfield sat in his office on the 32nd floor of Whitfield Global Logistics, staring at a quarterly report that showed a discrepancy in the shipping insurance ledger he could not quite make disappear no matter how many times he adjusted the numbers. 12 years of careful footwork, a payment here, a signature there, a mechanic paid enough to keep his mouth shut, and then paid again every few years to make sure it stayed shut, and still the ledger would not balance the way he needed it to. He closed the file, poured himself a drink at 11 in the morning, and told his assistant he wasn't taking calls for the rest of the day. That same week, Vanessa Whitfield Cole hosted a luncheon for her foundation's board. 12 women in tailored dresses discussing a charity gala with the seriousness other people reserve for actual crises. Grant Cole sat at the head of the table beside her, charming in the particular way of men who have learned that charm is cheaper than character and gets you further besides. He mentioned, in passing, over dessert, that the foundation's numbers looked thin this quarter, that perhaps it was time to think more seriously about the family's long-term financial planning, about Walter's health, about making sure things are handled properly before they need to be. Vanessa smiled and agreed and thought nothing more of it, the way people rarely notice the exact moment a seed gets planted in soil they didn't know they'd prepared for it. Back at the estate, the tremor in Walter's right hand had gotten harder to hide. He'd started keeping both hands beneath the table during board meetings, a habit his own children noticed but never asked him about directly, filing it under the general category of things about their father's aging they preferred not to examine too closely. Odessa noticed everything. She noticed when his signature on a grocery list started slanting differently than it used to. She noticed when he repeated a story twice in one evening without seeming to remember he'd already told it. She never mentioned these things to anyone outside that house. She simply began quietly managing what needed managing, organizing his pills into a weekly container she bought with her own money, making sure he ate something substantial before his evening medication instead of on an empty stomach the way he'd been doing it for months before she noticed. One evening in early autumn, Walter fell on the staircase leading up to his study, a stumble more than a real fall, but enough to leave him sitting on the third step from the bottom, his cane out of reach, his pride considerably more injured than his body. Odessa found him there 10 minutes later. She didn't gasp. She didn't fuss over him in the way he clearly dreaded. She simply walked over, extended her hand, and waited. "Don't need to make a production of it," he said, gripping her hand harder than either of them let on. "Wasn't planning to," she answered. "Man falls down a step. That's just Tuesday. Man refuses help getting up. That's just stubborn." He let out that same short laugh again, standing slowly, testing his weight before he trusted it. "You're going to outlive every one of us, Odessa Coleman." "Somebody's got to," she said, and helped him the rest of the way up, and neither of them spoke of it again, though something in the exchange had shifted permanently, The way a single conversation sometimes reveals a friendship had already been standing there, fully built, waiting for someone to finally notice it was finished. It was around this same time that Walter began asking Nathaniel Reyes to come by the house more frequently, ostensibly for routine business matters, though Nathaniel, a man who had known Walter for over 3 decades, sensed there was something else moving beneath the surface of these visits. Walter would disappear into his study with Nathaniel for hours at a time. The locked drawer opened and closed more often than it had been in years. Documents passed back and forth in a silence neither man seemed inclined to break with explanation. Odessa served them coffee during these meetings and noticed, without understanding why, that Walter always waited until she'd left the room before the real conversation began. The first real crack in the family's composure came on a Sunday afternoon in November, when Preston and Vanessa arrived together at the estate, an occurrence rare enough that Odessa noted it immediately as significant. They found their father in the study, and through the door left slightly ajar while she carried in a tray of refreshments. Odessa heard enough of the conversation to understand its shape even without hearing every word. "We just think it might be time to have someone take a look, Dad," Vanessa was saying, her voice carrying the practiced gentleness of someone who had rehearsed the sentence in the car on the way over. "A specialist, just to be safe." "I don't need a specialist," Walter said, his voice flat in the way Odessa had learned meant he was more unsettled than he wanted to show. "I need my children to stop looking at me like I'm already gone." "Nobody thinks you're gone," Preston said, though something in his tone suggested he was reading from a script rather than speaking from feeling. "We're just concerned. That's all this is. Concern." Odessa set the tray down and left the room as quickly as courtesy allowed, but the exchange stayed with her the rest of the day, a small stone lodge somewhere she couldn't quite dislodge it from. She had spent enough years in that house to recognize the difference between a family expressing love and a family building a case. And what she'd just overheard, she was beginning to understand, sounded considerably more like the second one. That night, after his children had left, Walter sat alone at the kitchen counter long after Odessa had finished her work, and for the first time in the 2 years she'd known him, she saw something in his face that looked less like stubbornness and more like fear. Not fear of dying. This was a different fear entirely. The fear of losing control of something before he'd had the chance to set it right. The fear of a man running out of time to fix a debt he'd been quietly paying down for over a decade without anyone, including the person he owed it to most, ever knowing it existed. "You're troubled tonight," Odessa said, not quite a question, setting a cup of tea in front of him, though he hadn't asked for one. "Some things you carry so long you forget what it felt like before you were carrying them," Walter said, more to the room than to her. "And then one day somebody tries to take the carrying out of your hands before you're finished, and you realize you're not ready to let it go." Not yet. She didn't press him. Nathaniel visited again 3 days later, and this time, when Odessa brought in the coffee, Walter didn't wait for her to leave before speaking. "Odessa," he said, and something in how he said her name made her pause at the door. "Whatever happens in this house in the next while, whatever you hear, whatever my children decide to do or say about me, I need you to know that I see you. I have seen you for a long time now. Whatever you think you know about why you're here, there's more to it than you understand, and one day, I promise you, you're going to understand all of it." She didn't know what to make of that in the moment, standing there with an empty coffee tray in her hands, the rain that had started that morning still tapping lightly against the study windows. She would think about that sentence more times than she could count in the months that followed. But that day was still a long way off, and between this quiet evening and that eventual reckoning stood a betrayal larger than either of them yet knew was coming. A betrayal built not out of hatred, but out of fear and greed dressed up convincingly as concern. And it was already, at that very moment, taking its first careful steps forward in a house across town where Grant Cole was on the phone with a private evaluator, offering him more money than the job should have ever required. Grant made that phone call from the driver's seat of his car in a parking garage downtown, the engine running, the radio off. A man who had learned a long time ago that the most damaging conversations of his life were best had somewhere no one else could overhear them. On the other end of the line was a private evaluator named Dr. Harlan Voss, a man whose credentials were real enough to survive a cursory background check, but whose ethics had softened considerably somewhere around his second divorce and the mounting debt that came with it. Grant didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I need a professional opinion," Grant said, "on a man's mental competency. Written up official. Something a judge would look at twice." "That depends entirely on the man," Voss said carefully, "and what the actual evaluation shows." "It'll show what it needs to show," Grant said, and named a figure large enough that Voss stopped asking careful questions altogether. That conversation took place on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Vanessa was sitting across from her husband at their kitchen table, turning a glass of wine slowly by its stem, listening to Grant explain, in the reasonable, patient tone he used whenever he wanted her to agree with something she hadn't yet realized she disagreed with. Why bringing in an independent evaluator to assess her father was simply responsible planning. "He's 78, Vanessa. He's had falls." Preston said, his hands shake so bad in meetings he can't hold a pen straight. "We're not doing anything wrong here. We're protecting him. And protecting what he built, before somebody less careful than us gets their hands on it." "He'd hate this," Vanessa said quietly, "if he knew we were even having this conversation." "He doesn't have to know," Grant said. "Not yet. Not until it's already done, and he sees it was the right call all along." Vanessa didn't answer that directly, which in the small, quiet grammar of their marriage had come to mean agreement more often than actual silence ever did. Preston needed the guardianship for reasons considerably less noble than protecting anything at all. The ledger discrepancy that had been eating at him for months had grown from a manageable problem into something closer to a crisis, an internal audit scheduled for the coming quarter that would, if it ran its natural course, eventually trace a series of shell payments back through 12 years of careful obfuscation to a settlement paid out the same year a 19-year-old named Marcus Coleman was killed 2 blocks from his community college. Guardianship over his father's estate would give him the authority to quietly restructure the accounts before anyone with real auditing power got close enough to ask the wrong questions. And that, more than any concern about his father's health, was the engine actually driving him forward. The visit came on a gray Sunday in late November, Preston and Vanessa arriving together in a show of unified concern that Walter recognized immediately as rehearsed. They sat in his study and made their case gently at first, then with increasing firmness as Walter's refusal grew more pointed. "This is not concern," Walter finally said, his voice rising enough that Odessa, passing in the hallway with a tray, stopped just outside the door rather than announce herself. "I built this company with my own 2 hands while the 2 of you were still in diapers. I know exactly what a man looks like when he's circling something that isn't his yet. I raised one of you. I'm looking at both of you doing it right now. We just want what's best for you, Dad," Preston said, quieter now. "And for the company. And for the family name. There are things that could come out if the wrong person got control of the finances at the wrong time. Things that would hurt more than just you." Walter went quiet at that. Odessa, standing in the hallway with a tray growing heavy in her hands, did not understand the weight behind that sentence. But she felt the temperature of the room change even through a closed door, the particular chill of a conversation that had just shifted from family disagreement into something considerably more dangerous. Dr. Voss conducted his evaluation on a Wednesday in early December, a 40-minute visit that Walter, still unaware of its true purpose, treated as an irritating formality. It did not matter. The report Voss submitted a week later bore only a passing resemblance to the evaluation he'd actually conducted, its language carefully constructed to suggest early signs of diminished capacity, phrases vague enough to survive scrutiny, and damning enough to build a legal case around. Grant filed the guardianship petition the following Monday. Walter learned of it not from his children directly, but from Nathaniel, who arrived at the estate unannounced on a Thursday evening. They filed, Nathaniel said, the moment the study door closed behind them. Preston and Vanessa. Guardianship petition. There's an evaluation attached from a Dr. Harlan Voss. Claims signs of diminished capacity. I've never heard that name in my life, Walter said, his voice flat with a fury that had gone past shouting into something colder and more dangerous. He examined you 3 weeks ago. You thought it was a physical for the company insurance policy. Walter's hand, the one with the tremor, curled slowly into a fist on the desk. They had me evaluated behind my back and didn't even have the nerve to do it honestly. I need you to understand how serious this is, Nathaniel said. If this petition succeeds, even partially, you lose control. Not just of the company. Everything. They could restrict who's allowed to visit you, Walter. They could restrict who's allowed to work in this house. Something in Walter's expression shifted at that last sentence, a flicker of alarm that went beyond the abstract threat of losing his fortune and settled instead on something considerably more personal. We fight it, Walter said. Whatever it takes. Let them dig, Walter finally said, after a long silence. Some things I intend to bring into the light myself, on my own terms, before anyone else gets the chance to drag them out sideways. The health scare came without warning on a Tuesday morning in mid-December, when the first real snow of the season had just begun dusting the long driveway. Odessa arrived and found the front door unlocked, which it never was. She found Walter on the floor of his study, one hand pressed weakly against his chest, his face gray, his breathing shallow. She did not scream. She knelt beside him, kept her voice low and steady, dialed for an ambulance with hands that did not shake even though everything inside her was shaking. The diagnosis was a cardiac event compounded by a possible minor stroke, significant enough to leave him disoriented for the better part of 2 days. Odessa stayed, sitting in the hard plastic chair beside his bed through that first night and the second day. It was during the second night, somewhere in the deep, disorienting hours, that Walter, still tangled in the fog of medication and exhaustion, began speaking softly to no one in particular. Marcus, he said, so quietly that Odessa, dozing in the chair beside him, almost missed it entirely. I should have told her. Should have told her a long time ago. Not right, keeping it from her this long. She stirred at the sound of the name, some part of her only half awake, uncertain if she'd actually heard it or dreamed it. She sat with the name for a long moment in the dark of that hospital room, telling herself it was a coincidence, a common name, a man disoriented and drugged speaking of anyone at all. What she did not see was Preston, standing just outside the door, who had heard his father say that name, and who went pale in a way that had nothing to do with hospital lighting, and who turned and walked quickly back down the corridor without announcing his presence at all. Preston returned the following morning, composed again, and it was on this visit, walking in to find Odessa still sitting in the same chair, unshowered, exhausted, her hand resting gently on his father's arm, that struck Preston, in his current state of barely controlled panic, as something considerably more sinister than simple devotion. "What exactly are you doing here?" Preston asked, his voice carrying an edge that made a nurse 2 beds down glance over. "Staying with your father," Odessa said simply. "Somebody needed to. He has family for that," Preston said. "He doesn't need his housekeeper camping out in his hospital room around the clock." "He didn't have anyone here for the first 6 hours," Odessa said, her voice even but firm. "Except me. I found him on the floor of his own study. I'm the one who called the ambulance." "How convenient," Preston said, his tone shifting now into something colder and more calculated. "A housekeeper just happens to be the only one there when a wealthy old man has a medical emergency. Just happens to be close enough that he's mumbling things in his sleep that nobody else in this family gets to hear." Odessa felt something cold settle into her chest at the accusation buried inside his words. If you're asking whether I've done anything except care for a man who's been kind to me, the answer is no, and you know it. And I think you're saying this because you're scared of something that has nothing to do with me at all. Security, Preston said, turning toward the nurse's station, his voice pitched to Carrie. I need someone from hospital security up here. This woman is not family. She has no legal standing to be in this room. She did not argue. She stood, smoothed her cardigan, and looked at Walter one last time, still sleeping, unaware that the one person who'd sat beside him through the worst of it was being walked out of the building by a man in a security uniform while his own son watched with his arms crossed. She was escorted out through the sliding glass doors into a parking lot dusted with snow, and stood there a moment in the cold, allowing herself exactly one long, unsteady breath before she straightened her shoulders and walked to her car. Walter woke fully that same afternoon and asked, almost immediately, where Odessa was. When Preston explained smoothly that he'd asked the housekeeper to leave given some concerning behavior, Walter's reaction was not what his son had anticipated. Concerning behavior, Walter repeated, his voice low and dangerous in a way that made Preston take an involuntary step back from the bed. Get her back here. Now. Preston did not comply, and by the time actual visiting restrictions were formally put in place 2 days later, drafted quietly under the umbrella of the pending guardianship petition, Odessa Coleman's name had been added to a list of individuals barred from visiting Walter Whitfield without prior family approval. Nathaniel appeared at Odessa's door 3 days after her removal from the hospital, dressed not in the sharp suits she was accustomed to seeing him in at the estate, but in a simple wool coat. Walter has been asking for you every day since he woke up, Nathaniel said, not wasting time on preamble. Once she'd let him in and sat him at her small kitchen table. He's furious about what Preston did. Doesn't much matter what he wants, Odessa said, her arms crossed. There's a piece of paper now says I'm not allowed near him. That's exactly why I'm here, Nathaniel said. He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper, sliding it across the table. I was contacted 2 days ago by someone inside Whitfield Global Logistics, a junior accountant. He says he's seen transaction records that don't match anything legitimate, dated over a decade ago, run through accounts that only Preston has authority over. He mentioned you by name. Why would he think I'd know anything about company finances? Odessa asked. I don't know, Nathaniel admitted. But I trust Walter, and Walter trusts you more than he's ever trusted almost anyone in his life. And right now, you're the only door I have left to knock on. She agreed to meet the young accountant, Terrence, 2 days later, in a coffee shop far enough from downtown that no one from Whitfield Global was likely to recognize either of them. There's payments going out over 12 years, Terrence said, sliding a thin folder across the table, all authorized by Preston Whitfield personally, going to the same 2 accounts every few years like clockwork. One's registered to a mechanic, a man named Curtis Odom, runs a small shop on the west side. The other's harder to trace. And there's a note attached to the earliest one, just 2 words. Handle quietly. Odessa opened the folder with hands that had gone very still, scanning the dates, and something about the timeline nagged at her. 12 years. The same span of time, almost to the month, since a car she'd never found had struck her son on a dark street and kept driving. 2 nights later, unable to sleep, Odessa drove to the estate, using the spare key Walter had given her over a year earlier, moving through the dark house quietly, out to the garage where a single bulb flickered weakly overhead. She stood in front of the tarp for a long moment before she made herself reach out and pull it back. Beneath the canvas sat a car, its front bumper repaired in a way that didn't quite match the rest of the body, the kind of repair job done quickly and quietly by someone who understood exactly how to make damage disappear. The license plate meant nothing to her. The make and model meant everything. Matching, almost exactly, The description that had appeared in a police report she had read so many times over the past 12 years that its words had worn grooves into her memory. She told herself dark blue sedans were common. But some part of her was already moving past reasonable doubt and into a colder, more certain place. And by the time she covered the car back up and drove home that night, she understood she was not going to be able to leave this alone until she knew everything. She brought Terrence's folder and her own suspicions to Nathaniel 2 days later. It took him 4 days to get the original police file released, and when he finally sat across from Odessa again, he had 2 folders open in front of him, one from Whitfield Global's archived payment records, one from the Cincinnati Police Department's cold case files. He turned them both toward her without a word, and she saw, side by side, a payment authorized by Preston Whitfield to Curtis Odom, dated 6 days after her son's death, and a note in the original police file describing a car matching that same description parked outside Curtis Odom's shop the following week, a lead the department had abandoned when the shop owner claimed no memory of any such vehicle. Preston paid him, Odessa said, her voice very quiet, very controlled. Preston Whitfield paid a mechanic to fix a car that killed my son, and then paid him again and again for 12 years to keep him quiet about it. I believe so, Nathaniel said. I'm sorry, Odessa. I am so deeply sorry. She did not cry in that office. I need to hear him say it, she said. I need to look at that man's face while he tells me what he did to my son. The confrontation happened 3 days later, in the same study where Preston had once accused Odessa of manipulating his father for money. He opened the folder slowly, his practiced composure cracking the instant he saw what was inside. Where did you get this? He said, his voice barely above a whisper. Doesn't matter where I got it, Odessa said. What matters is whether it's true. Look at me and tell me it's not true. Preston put his face in his hands. I was drunk, he said. I want you to know that first, because it doesn't excuse anything, but I need you to understand I wasn't some monster who did this on purpose. I was driving home from a business dinner, I'd had too much, and I didn't even see him until it was already too late to stop. I panicked. I know that's not an excuse. There is no excuse. But I panicked, and I drove away, and I told myself if I turn myself and I destroy everything. And I was a coward, and I made the choice a coward makes. And I have hated myself every single day for 12 years, and it has never once been enough. You let a mother bury her son not knowing, Odessa said, her voice shaking now for the first time. You let me ask God every night for years why nobody was ever caught. And the answer was in your bank account the whole time. My father found out, Preston said quietly, 2 years after it happened. He didn't turn me in. He just decided the answer wasn't going to come from a courtroom. Odessa left Preston sitting alone in that study and asked Nathaniel to take her to see Walter immediately. He was in his bedroom, weak from the hospital stay, and when she walked in, he did not pretend confusion. You know, he said simply. I know what your son did, Odessa said. I don't yet know what you did about it, except pay for his silence right alongside him. I didn't pay for silence, Walter said, his voice weaker than she'd ever heard it, but steady in its conviction. Or I did, in the beginning, because I was afraid too. But I made a different decision about you. I found out where you worked, back then, a woman raising a boy alone, cleaning houses to make ends meet. And I couldn't give you back your son, and I couldn't give you the justice a courtroom might have. So I did the only thing I could live with instead. I made sure you never had to worry about money again for the rest of your life, quietly, without you knowing where it came from. And when your previous housekeeping job ended, I made sure this position was offered to you, so I could see you, every day, and try in whatever small way I could to make right what my family had taken from you. You hired me out of guilt, Odessa said, her voice breaking now. 12 years, Walter. I sat with you. I nursed you. I called you my friend. And I let myself believe, somewhere along the way, that you actually were, Walter said, tears now openly on his face. Because loving you honestly was the only part of this whole terrible arrangement that never once felt like a lie. I am not asking you to forgive me. I only wanted you to finally know the truth, on my own terms, before I ran out of time to tell you myself. The guardianship hearing took place on a Thursday morning in January. Dr. Voss folded under cross-examination within the first hour, his answers growing evasive the moment Nathaniel produced bank records showing a payment from Grant's personal account 3 days before the evaluation had even taken place. Vanessa sat beside her husband throughout this unraveling, and it was her reaction that shifted the temperature of the room. "Did you know?" she asked Grant, her voice low but carrying easily in the hushed courtroom, "that this evaluation wasn't real? Did you know this whole time?" Grant did not answer her, which in the small, quiet grammar of their marriage had always meant agreement. The petition was dismissed before the lunch recess. Nathaniel, with Odessa's permission, submitted the additional evidence connecting Preston to the 12-year-old hit and run, and requested the court refer the matter to the district attorney. Preston was arrested 3 weeks later, in the lobby of Whitfield Global Logistics, in full view of employees who watched in stunned silence as their COO was let out in handcuffs on charges of vehicular manslaughter, leaving the scene of an accident and obstruction of justice. Vanessa learned the full truth of what her brother had done in that same courtroom, in front of reporters, and the devastation on her face in that moment was, for the first time since this story began, entirely genuine. Walter did not live to see the criminal case reach its conclusion. He passed quietly in his sleep 6 weeks after the guardianship hearing, having spent his final weeks visiting quietly with Odessa, the two of them sitting together in his study in a silence that had finally become an honest one. Which brings the story back to that marble conference room, rain against the windows, Preston's chair now empty, Vanessa sitting alone in the black dress she'd chosen that morning, and Nathaniel reading the words that would eventually reach Odessa in the hallway outside. "To my housekeeper, Odessa Rae Coleman, I leave the entirety of my estate." In the months that followed, Odessa used a significant portion of the estate to establish a foundation in Marcus's name, funding a scholarship program at the community college he'd never finished attending, and a road safety initiative aimed at improving lighting and crosswalk visibility across Cincinnati. The exact kind of investment that might have given her son a better chance on the night a driver failed to see him crossing a poorly lit street. Vanessa reached out to Odessa herself several months after the will reading, seeking not any portion of the inheritance, but simply to understand, honestly, and without an audience, the man her father had actually been in his final years. The two women met for coffee more than once in the year that followed, an unlikely, careful friendship built slowly on the shared wreckage of a family secret neither of them had asked to inherit. Odessa still keeps 2 coffee cups in her cabinet, and on certain mornings now, for the first time in over a decade, she pours into both of them, one for herself, and one, when Vanessa visits, for a woman who has become, in her own imperfect and evolving way, something like the family Odessa lost the right to expect from the Whitfields the night her son died on a dark Cincinnati street, and something she has finally, after everything, allowed herself to accept in its place.